Ayan. Proceed na po tayo to discuss the revised School Safety Assessment Tool. We have a representative from Bureau of Human Resource and Organizational Development, School Effectiveness Division, Ms. Marian Efondo. Good afternoon po, Ms. Marian.
Good afternoon din po. Good afternoon again po. Ako po si Marian from School Effectiveness Division. So to proceed po, So first, we're going to discuss the purpose and objectives of the revised School Safety Assessment Tool, and then followed by our sample format of the revised SSAT. And we'll also see the comparison of the 2021 SSAT and our revised SSAT. Also, general updates, and then summary of our revised indicators, and lastly, the process flow of data collection and report generation. So to start with our purpose and objectives, we have identified 3. So number 1, the SSAT is intended to assess the readiness of schools to participate in the progressive expansion of face-to-face classes in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, to gather information from schools in preparation for the safe reopening of systems. And lastly, to identify key areas for the provision of support and technical assistance to schools from the different governance levels. So to add more emphasis po, ayan. So what is the SSAT for and what is it not for? So kaka-mention lang natin, ang pinaka-purpose niya po talaga is to help our schools prepare for the progressive expansion of face-to-face classes, inform the schools of the required indicators and standards that the schools need to meet in preparation for the eventual reopening of classes while ensuring safety of the learners and school personnel. And syempre po, the result of the SSAT can be used by our SDOS, regional offices, and of course, central office in providing support and technical assistance. Also, we would like to emphasize that the School Safety Assessment Tool is not the final determinant on the school's participation to the progressive expansion of the face-to-face classes. Again, that is only meant to prepare our school. For the sample format of our SSAT, for sure po, most of us familiar na dito, no? So we have our main area, component, main indicator, and as you can see, we have now categorized our sub-indicators into the required and the optional. So kanina po, nabanggit din sa previous discussions that some of the indicators in the revised SSAT have been relaxed dahil nga mas gumaganda na po ang sitwasyon natin in terms of COVID-19 pandemic. So in our 2021 SSAT, we have 48 main indicators. However, in our revised SSAT, we have reduced the main indicators to 42 na lang. And then, as you can see po, may significant change din sa numbers ng sub-indicators. So, from 161 sub-indicators, we now have 68, and 60 are required sub-indicators, and 8 are optional. So, when we say main areas, these are the 4 fundamental areas where mechanisms and standards in the progressive expansion of face-to-face classes are categorized. Also, when we say components, these are the subcategories of the main areas. And for the main indicators, ito naman po yung mga required standards that must be met by the schools. So, our main indicators may have sub-indicators. For the required sub-indicators, these are the specific, non-negotiable standards that must be met along with their respective main indicators. And for our optional, these are the additional indicators that the schools may comply with for additional precautionary measures. Alright, so moving forward, here are our general updates for the revised School Safety Assessment Tool. Number 1, all public and private schools shall answer the revised SSAT. But the schools that have already accomplished the 2021 SSAT are no longer required to answer the revised SSAT, but may use it to further guide their progressive expansion of the face-to-face classes. So kung makikita na po natin, naka-upload na sa ating DepEd website ang DM on revised SSAT. Pag kinompare po natin yung dalawa, mas mahirap actually or mas strict ang indicators and instructions natin sa 2021 SSAT. So pero kung gusto pa din natin siyang sagutin, okay lang naman po. Pwede natin na lang siyang gamitin as our guide. Number 2, schools need to meet all required indicators to be allowed to participate in the progressive expansion of the face-to-face classes. They may also comply with optional indicators as applicable. And kanina pa nabanggit natin that our sub-indicators are grouped into 2. So we them into required and optional. And number 4, the revised SSAT, we would like to emphasize this one, that the revised SSAT is accordance with the DepEd DOH JMC1 series of 2022, the revised operational guidelines on the progressive expansion of face-to-face learning modality, and our DepEd order on the progressive expansion of face-to-face classes. So, sana po hindi lang yung school safety assessment tool yung tingnan natin. Tingnan natin lahat ng policies relevant to the progressive expansion of face-to-face classes, lalo pa ang JMC and ang ating DepEd order. Kasi po, mas ina-explain niya or mas ina-elaborate niya yung mga indicators na nakapaloob sa SSAT para mas maintindihan mo. Ayan. May last pa po. May number 5. Balik lang po. Ayan. For number 5, we also have the LGU concurrence and parents' consent have been removed as indicators but are retained in the tool since these are necessary requirements to be fully compliant and secure authorization to participate in the progressive expansion of the face-to-face classes. So, in the 2021 SSAT part po ang ating LGU concurrence and parents' consent sa main indicator. Sa revised SSAT, removed siya as main indicators, pero po, parte pa rin siya ng tool dahil importanteng yes siya para maging fully compliant tayo or ma-allow tayo to participate sa progressive expansion. But, ito po, next slide po. But in the revised tool, it will now be filled out by the SDO composite team. Nasa bottom part po siya ng tool, yung LGU concurrence, parents' consent, and vaccination of school personnel. This will be filled out by our composite team during the validation. Alright. Next po. So, now we move forward to the summary of revised indicators. So, again, with the continuous improvement of COVID-19 situation in the country and considering the results of the pilot study on face-to-face and several required sub-indicators were revised, removed, and or transferred to optional indicators. For the indicators that have been removed or modified, ito po siya. So number 1, we have provision of an alternative to yellow trash bags in case it is not available. Changing the instruction in some indicators from 1:1 ratio to availability, and remove the provision requiring face shield, toothbrush, and toothpaste, and remove the provision requiring availability of sterilization box to disinfect outlets like this. For our required indicators naman that were transferred to optional indicators, we have the following: installation of CO2 monitoring devices, use of air purifiers, and 3, designation of separate entrance and exit points in school, and designation of entrance and exit points in the classroom. And lastly, establishment of drop-off and pick-up points that are clearly identified. So ito po, pasadahan lang natin, bilis yung specific indicators na na-mention po natin kanina. So as mentioned, ito pong mga naka-color red, yan yung ni-remove na natin. So we removed the availability of sterilization box and we changed to optional indicators yung installation of CO2 monitoring devices and use of air purifiers in air-conditioned spaces. Also, we would like to emphasize na for the CO2 monitoring devices, hindi po kailangan lagyan ang bawat enclosed space. Pwede pong sa isang school, isang CO2 monitoring device lang ang gagawin. Next po. Also, as mentioned kanina, one of our revisions in our school safety assessment tool is changing the instruction from 1:1 to availability. So, availability of surgical mask na lang, availability of antibacterial. Hindi na siya 1:1. Next po, we also remove the indicators requiring toothbrush and toothpaste and at the same time, schedule of supervised hand washing and toothbrushing activities. Next po. And also, as mentioned po kanina, we have modified our indicator on the yellow trash bag. So, ito na siya. In case a yellow trash bag or container is not available, a separate bag or container marked for infectious medical waste identifiable by the waste collector like yellow ribbon, yellow colored tag, should be available for disposal of all used PPE. Also, yan po, pinalitan na natin yung 1:1 to availability ng ating self-learning modules, textbooks, and WL. Next po. Also, we have modified the minimum contact time for teaching and learning. So, for kindergarten and grade 1, we have 4 hours, and grades 2 to 12, we have 5 hours. Also po, we have removed this indicator. The school has secured adequate supply of face masks, face shields, and other COVID-19 protective gear. And yun po, pinalitan din natin yung 1:1 to availability of hand sanitizers, alcohol-based solutions, and other disinfectants. And lastly, we have changed to optional sub-indicator ang ating designated waiting area with proper ventilation because we understand po that not all schools have enough spaces for this. Ayan. So that ends our summary of revisions on our revised school safety assessment. Now, for our process flow, so we start with process flow for schools. Anong gagawin ni school? Once ma-receive na po ni school ang copy ng revised SSAT, so the schools need to ensure compliance with all the required indicators in our revised SSAT. After that, accomplish the revised SSAT via Google Forms. After that, undergo validation to be conducted by our SDO composite team. So for our validation po, in the pilot study, we required the SDO to do field visits. Sa validation naman po ngayon, alam po natin, baka hindi lahat ng divisions kayanin na bisitahin lahat ng school sa ating division. So, may option po tayo. It's either we do field visits or pwede po natin i-require ang schools to submit pertinent documents, photos, or videos para po mapatunayan na talagang na-meet nila yung indication. So, nasa discarded din po yun ni SDO Composite. Now, after validation, if the schools pass the validation conducted by our SDO Composite team, they will now answer the Google Forms on validation status of SSAT compliance. So, itong Google Forms on validation status of SSAT compliance will provide the regional office and the central office a quick count ng mga schools na nakapasa. However, kapag ang school naman, after ng validation, nakita po ni SDO Composite team na they did not meet the required indicators, the schools will receive technical assistance from our SDO. And until such time that our schools meet all required indicators, saka lang po sila pwedeng sumagot ng ating Google Forms on validation status of SSAT compliance for the quick count. Yan. For the process flow naman po, for our SDOs, so syempre, the first step is to create an online version of the revised SSAT via Google Forms. So, SDO po ang gagawa nito. We will be releasing separate memorandum containing the soft copy po, yung link kung saan pwede natin i-download yung Excel sheet copy ng ating SSAT. And then, second, share the link of the revised SSAT via Google Forms to the school. Tapos, lastly, for data collection, create a composite team that will validate the data submitted by the schools if you haven't organized yet. For the report generation naman po, consolidate the revised SSAT via Google Forms. So since naka-Google Forms po siya, easier for the SDO to collect the data and at the same time to summarize and check yung mga indicators na hindi pa po na-achieve. So syempre may back-end data po yun, yung Google Forms natin. The SDO can use it as a reference in providing guidance and technical assistance to our schools na medyo nahihirapan pa sa pag-achieve ng ating required indicator. After that, validate the data submitted by the school. So schools shall be categorized based on their SSAT compliance. So pag fully compliant, bibigyan na po siya ni SDO ng link of the Google Forms on validation status of SSAT compliance for the regional offices. Kapag pending compliance naman, the SDO composite team shall provide technical assistance to the schools. And again, until such time na ma-meet ng ating schools ang ating indicators, ang ating required indicators, saka lang po siya pwedeng sumagot ng Google Forms on validation status of SSAT compliance para sa ating webcam. Now, for the last process flow, sa regional office naman. So, merong dalawa. For the data collection, the ROs need to share the link of the Google Forms on validation status of SSAT compliance with their respective SDOs. And then, syempre, double-check and summarize the back-end data of the Google Forms on the validation status of SSAT compliance. For the duties or duties and roles naman of the central office. So, kanina meron tayong nababanggit na Google Form. So, it will be the central office who shall create the Google Forms on the validation status of SSAT compliance. And we will disseminate this information through our memorandum on the process flow of SSAT. Also, we understand na dahil nga limitado po ang ating orientation to virtual lang, medyo mahirap i-communicate ang mga napakadaming information. So we will also be disseminating the SSAT info packet which will serve as our advocacy. So ayan po, that ends our discussion on the revised school safety assessment. Thank you very much po for listening.